There's so much of silence now.
Sure. So, greetings everyone. Welcome to the ninth edition of the Online Education Leadership Forum panel discussion series focused on transforming education for human flourishing. Thank you so much for investing your time with us on a weekday. My name is Aaryan Salman and I'm the moderator for this panel discussion. Today we have a stellar panel that will discuss the role of educators in fostering gender diversity and inclusion in our series entitled Education in the Times of Corona, where we'll be discussing the strategies and approaches that we must take towards fostering gender diversity and inclusion that is so crucial in our efforts of transforming education for human flourishing. Also, we'll be sharing relevant and related resources with you within 72 hours of this live broadcast. So check out the event page on our website, globalcitizenshipfoundation.org after 72 hours, or follow us on our social media profiles to receive the latest updates on the same. In the previous 8 editions of the OELF, we explored various dimensions of education in the times of Corona and beyond. The recordings of the previous 8 panel discussions and the live broadcast of this panel discussion are available both on our website and on our social media channels, including YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. So join us on our social media pages and be part of our current and future initiatives. To receive your certificate of participation, please fill in the special certificate request form that will be made available right at the end of the panel discussion on Zoom, Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. I hope you will continue to support us by actively sharing your ideas, suggestions, and feedback. Uh, this will help us in improving the way we serve you and boost our efforts of advancing the discourse on transforming education for human flourishing. As you know, we continue to live in increasingly challenging and uncertain times with enormous changes and disruptions to our lives and our professions. It is a moment for us to assume active global citizenship and support those in need. Having said that, I would also like to take this moment to mark a minute of silence for those who have lost their lives to the pandemic, the grieving individuals and the families, and in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement in the US and around the world. Thank you. Now we ring the bell to thank and honor the healthcare workers, our educators, and others on the front line who are carrying out essential roles selflessly, continuing their day-to-day duties inside and outside the home in support of us all. Thank you. The Online Education Leadership Forum was started with the objective to provide a platform for educational leaders to shape, empower, influence, and advance the discourse on and be a springboard aiding action towards transforming education for human flourishing. Gender as a part of one's identity is hard to understand even for adults, let alone young people. Even within the education system, it is a default perspective to view gender in binaries. There appears to be either a lack of awareness of the gender spectrum that exists, or that gender diversity and inclusion are seen as a taboo or stereotype that is best avoided. This can be a topic for that educators and school leaders are not always sure how best to address. Childhood and adolescence are very defining and vulnerable moments in a person's life. Lack of active efforts of fostering gender diversity and inclusion in education are linked to gender stereotyping, intolerance, harassment, bullying, hate, and violence against young people. As per the Human Rights Campaign survey, LGBT youth are more than twice as likely as non-LGBT youth to say they have been verbally harassed, bullied, assaulted, or called names at school. There have been studies that highlight the adverse impact of gender stereotyping on students' self-concept, confidence, and academic achievement. It is critical that we get a better understanding of the concerns, needs, and experiences of our young people. Studies have highlighted how creating supportive environment for gender expansive students improves educational outcomes for all students and not just those who may identify themselves as gender expansive. As COVID-19 continues to sweep the world, millions of young people have been affected by mental health issues. Studies and surveys across the world highlight the extreme vulnerability and risk faced by gender expansive young people who feel they have been hit harder by depression, loneliness, and stigmatization during the lockdown. We all know the important role educators and schools can play in fostering more inclusive, just, peaceful, secure, sustainable, and resilient societies. Through this panel discussion, we aim to explore how educators can create a safe space that actively fosters diversity, equity, and inclusion, leaving no one behind, which is also the motto of the Sustainable Development Goals. I hope this panel discussion helps in shaping a more inclusive view of the gender spectrum that can enhance and inform our pedagogical practice and our worldview, in addition to providing us with practical tips and strategies to foster gender diversity and inclusion. Our approach to creating inclusive and equitable systems that actively foster diversity will determine how successful we are at transforming education for human flourishing. Through the Education in the Times of Corona online series, the Global Citizenship Foundation and the Council for Global Citizenship Education are committed to supporting school leaders and educators by connecting experts, practitioners, and school leaders from across the globe to discuss and share ideas, best practices, and perspectives to navigate and lead through this crisis. So our goal today is, whatever your role is in the education sector, that you'll come away with something, a new idea, a fresh perspective, a new strategy that you can apply to be more successful at doing what you're doing best, while ensuring gender diversity and inclusion in your classrooms and your schools, to ensure that no one is left behind in our efforts of fostering human flourishing. So here's the format to give you an idea of what to expect. First, we'll take a few minutes to introduce our awesome panelists, who I must admit are some of the most inspiring individuals fostering diversity, equity, and inclusion in India, Thailand, UK, United States, and around the world. Then I'll kick off the conversation by opening the floor to the panelists. And in the second half of our time today, we'll open the floor to give you an opportunity to directly ask specific questions that you have to our panelists by either posting your questions or virtually raising your hand by pressing the reaction button on the bottom of your screen on Zoom platform. Also, please feel free to share your thoughts and ideas in the chat section on all our platforms anytime during the discussion and create a learning and engaging experience for all. The idea is to navigate through the present and upcoming opportunities, issues, challenges together to be able to transform education for human flourishing. Sounds good? All right, great. So one thing that we'll do now is begin with the panel introductions. It is my great pleasure to welcome Hannah Jepson, founder of LGBTed, a national LGBTQ plus organization in the UK that supports educators to foster gender diversity and inclusion in their schools and colleges. Also, she's a business psychologist and director at Engaging for Success UK. Her projects include delivering diversity and inclusion training and strategies and developing behavioral competency frameworks and assessment solutions. Hannah's academic research concerns the experiences of gay women in workplace. She is also the lead coach for a national LGBTQ plus inclusion in education award in partnership with Lead Beckett University. I take great pleasure in welcoming Cody Freeman, lecturer at the Faculty of Learning Sciences and Education at Thammasat University in Thailand. Cody specializes in gender and sexuality studies, comparative and international education, democratic education, social movements, and sociology of education. He has been researching and developing innovative methods of education through gamification of learning and fostering education for democracy and transformation. I take immense pleasure in welcoming Dr. Chandrika Devarakonda, Senior Lecturer in the Faculty of Education and Children's Services at the University of Chester in the UK since 2005. She has extensively worked on projects that involve special schools, has coordinated with community-based rehabilitation projects in India and also with the ethnic minority communities in Manchester, in addition to teaching at various higher education institutions across the world. Dr. Chandrika's teaching work and her publications focus on a wide range of issues such as early childhood, parenting partnerships, diversity, and inclusion. It is my deepest pleasure to welcome Jennifer Brown, founder and CEO of Jennifer Brown Consulting USA. And she's also the host of the Willing to Change podcast. Jennifer's workplace strategies have been employed by some of the top Fortune 500 companies and nonprofits. As an LGBT entrepreneur and a diversity and inclusion expert, she coaches business leaders worldwide on critical issues of talent and workplace strategy. She's the author of Inclusion, Diversity, The New Workplace, and The Will to Change. And her latest book, How to Be an Inclusive Leader, is a OWL award shortlist and a Notilius Book Award winner in business category. I take great pleasure in welcoming Dr. Ashok Pandey, the Chairperson of the Council for Global Citizenship Education and the Director of Alcon Group of Schools India. He's the author of Launch Inspiring Educational Leadership and the Pedagogical Life, Essays on Educating India. Now I open the floor to the panelists by requesting Hannah to make her initial remarks.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me and welcoming me here. It's really exciting to be here with such an amazing lineup of panelists, and I think the work that you're doing is so important. So happy to be here and to share some of my thoughts. Please do ring the bell if I go over time. So yeah, I'm Hannah Jepson. I'm one of the founders of LGBTed UK. We founded LGBTed UK a couple of years ago now, and really that came from a kind of a deep concern that there wasn't enough happening in our schools to think about this work. So of course we work with our LGBT young people, but we also work with our LGBT young staff as well. So part of our kind of philosophy here is about using adults as educators and as agents of change. There are some great things happening already for young people in terms of curriculum change and in terms of fostering their well-being, but there wasn't a huge amount before we set out in terms of supporting adults in education to be authentic. Partly that's because of their fear around education and gender non-conforming people or LGBT people. So part of our work at LGBTed UK is about supporting educators so that they can be the role models that we all needed when we were at school. And we see that as a really important thing that we do. But actually our work is twofold. So we work with individuals as educators to help them realize how they can be more authentic in their schools as leaders or as teachers as they grow through their career. But also we work with the system to try and ensure that the system is allowing those people to flourish and to be authentic in their schools, which as a byproduct is going to help those young people. We see that as really important, that we're showing our young people that there's a richness in society that they can be a part of, and that we're showing them that there is more than what they've learned when they've grown up, which often is quite a binary, traditional set of things. And we know that that comes in quite early and it's ingrained, and it's very hard to shift those practices. If we don't hear that at home, that there's a difference and a richness, and we don't hear it at school, we can often feel isolated. And as you referred to, the link between mental health issues and the LGBTQ community isn't kind of lost on us. So that's part of the work that we do as well. So yeah, we're taking a holistic approach, but we're working with adults as educators and as agents of change so that we can be the role models that we needed when we were at school. And I'm really excited to be here and hear from everyone else about the great work that they're doing.
Thank you, Hannah. So I yield the floor to Cody.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. My name is Cody Freeman. I'm a lecturer at Thammasat University here in Thailand. And I'm also the founder of the Global Center, which is an NGO that creates freedom through education for LGBTI plus youth globally. And as we're about to launch the NGO, we keep asking the question, what is freedom? How do we become free in our diverse genders and sexualities? And in a global pandemic, where we need the structure to keep people safe, how do we balance freedom with control? So I personally believe that we get to freedom by overcoming oppression and using education as a tool for empowerment and transformation. Education, though, has historically, before COVID, been used as a tool for control, for socialization, for silence around certain people, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex people. So what better time than now to transform these systems, right? I found that engaging through a queer mindset has helped this transformation process. So queer is questioning what is normal. And in these times that are really abnormal, how can we transform ourselves and society into a more open, free, new normal? But I also believe this queer mindset has to be back with, I say, 4 practical actions, which is education, advocacy, research, and support, which I call an all ears approach. And practical examples of stuff we've been doing during COVID in this all ears approach is listening, reading books that you haven't had the attention to read before, especially anti-racism books for the US context. Different things are needed for different contexts. Educating yourself on new ideas and asking new questions you haven't asked before. Becoming aware when we put ourselves or others in boxes and when we're really quick to judgment. Transforming yourself by going within and becoming aware of your presence and your patterns of behavior, developing new mindsets, questioning new structures, advocating on social media, and even attending really transformative spaces and talks like this. So we now have this opportunity to really brainstorm long-term strategies and build movements and tackle long-standing issues that we really haven't had the attention to really pause, acknowledge, appreciate, and fully commit to before. And so I think this brings empowerment, and that's what leads to transforming ourselves, our societies, to create freedom. So I encourage everyone on this call and to think about how education, advocacy, research, and support, what it looks like in your life and what's appropriate for your context as well. But in the meantime, thank you everyone for your ongoing work to create this freedom.
Thank you, Cody. Dr. Chandrika, the floor is yours. One of the things that we are also looking at, I'm sure, like, we'll come to that, is to see if we can look at identifying what role do teachers play in the entire context of fostering diversity and inclusion.
Thank you very much for that awesome introduction. Thank you. Thanks very much for this opportunity. I'm ever grateful to you for that. I'd like to unpack the title a little bit very briefly, and then I'll actually tell what I'm going to suggest. Role of educators in fostering gender diversity and inclusion is a very important topic in the current context. And as you said, educators or teachers at any stage of your life, whether it's in your nurseries or primary school, secondary school, universities, they do make a very huge impact on us. And then we do go back to the values that they have taught us. And from that perspective, I'd like to bring in right from the early start that we make. Early childhood is a very, very important stage of our lives. And we all very well know that most of the development happens in early childhood. And it's very important for children to be exposed to differences so that they could be accepted and they can accept everybody very well. Yeah, and then I would like to bring in my own perspective of gender diversity and also how I relate to the concept of inclusion. Yeah. So starting off with the concept of gender diversity, I think it is, as you rightly mentioned, it's still considered a taboo in lots of societies. And It's an umbrella term that is used to describe gender identities that demonstrate a diversity of expression beyond the binary framework of being male and female, which is very much, I think the individual needs to be respected and accepted rather than attaching the labels. I think for me, the labels actually is a huge box, which could be the huge barrier again. From the perspective how I understand inclusion, I strongly believe that education is a basic human right and foundation for a more just society, or social justice, as we were saying earlier. And I'm quite influenced by a professor at University of Manchester, who is Mel Ainscough. In one of his publications, published in 2006, Ainscough and his colleagues suggested that inclusion involves a process that is concerned with the identification and removal of barriers to the presence, participation, and achievement of all students. And when I say all students, I actually have everybody under that huge umbrella. And I think that aspect of presence, participation, and achievement is quite a long process. So you're not only encouraging children to be present in the setting, but then you're also encouraging them to participate and also to help them achieve as educators in a setting. And also, I'm quite aware that again, from an early childhood perspective, it's very important for the educators to lay the right foundations for young children to gain a positive attitude wherein they will be able to respect and accept everyone irrespective of differences and diversity. And also, childhood is an impressionable age, and you have to ensure that children are open and accepting differences with open arms. And from the perspective of educators, I mentioned educators, children, but then for me, it's very important to have the families within the perspective as well. Because children could be living with the families, which could be different from each other in terms of the family context, family backgrounds can be quite different. So from that perspective, it's very important to understand how the children, educators themselves, and the families can be different in any context. And last point, I'd like to bring in the inconsistencies in although there are policies, global policies, national policies, which seems to point to equal opportunities, equity, and enabling every child to have those opportunities. But then due to the social and cultural context, it could be that these opportunities may be restricted for, and there could be lots of barriers. So I'd like to stop there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chandrika. I yield the floor to Jennifer.
Hello, everybody. I'm Jennifer Brown, and I'm going to share a little bit about me in the chat in case you want to learn a little bit more about my work. So I am based in the US in New York, and I focus on helping organizations become more inclusive places where we can feel, as I say, welcomed, valued, respected, and heard. So cultures of belonging where we can thrive. And I think for all of us as educators, I consider myself an educator of the adults in those systems, but I'm very mindful of what happens before talent enters our organizations, what happens in the classroom, how much they are encouraged to embrace all of who they are. And I'm very mindful of how problems with confidence, for example, for girls, young women, those who identify as LGBTQ or queer identified women, and specifically, and even boys in those classrooms, and also boys becoming men, cisgender men and queer men as well, how they play a role in terms of gender equity and inclusion as well. So I'm fascinated with the dynamic that either leads a young person to embrace all of who they are and have the language to talk about who they are, and to see the role models that they need to see that they haven't seen in the past, to see themselves, to understand who they are. So I was a closeted LGBTQ person for now 20, back for 15 years in the early part of my career. And I didn't see role models. I didn't have language for referring to myself. And it drove a lot of my professional decisions. And I just want to remind everybody that, young people may come out to themselves in their classrooms. They may have that confidence, but what happens in the workplace is that they are challenged. That confidence and that embracing of their own authenticity is challenged in workplaces that are blind to their own biases. And so I'm very interested in how we grow a generation of young people that will actually be able to create change in the workplace they find themselves in, and that they will stick to their identity and be proud of it. And they will have the language and the solid foundation to bring their full selves to work in order to shift that institution. But sadly, I do read statistics where young people go back in the closet for LGBTQ identity when they begin work because they perceive a not a supportive environment. And this is true also for cisgender women, that they go dark in terms of their confidence, in terms of their initiative, because they see a lack of role models, because they're entering a system that is fundamentally misogynistic. And so what educators can do is to talk about different kinds of being female, all kinds of varieties of identities. We can role model strong behavior and confidence for our girls. And we can talk about all gender identities and expressions as part of our gender. And we can celebrate that more intentionally in our curriculums and in the voices that we center in our classrooms, the examples we use, the stories we tell, the storytellers we bring, that because not all of us can speak to the lived experience of all kinds of women and girls. So I think educators, we play such an important role. And I want a strong cohort and generation to come into workplaces, because the workplaces need us. They need us to use our voice, and they need us to be confident in the way we show up, and they need us to be fluent in terms of all the gender identities that are available to us.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jennifer. Now I yield the floor to Dr. Pandey.
Yeah, good afternoon, and thank you, Aaryan, and my distinguished panelists have opened the entire perspective on it, and therefore I will only take it forward from what Jennifer has said. I think education is the only vehicle which has the potential to eliminate all forms of discrimination. And education is the only vehicle through which we can foster how our schools, our colleges, communities, workplaces can become more inclusive. So there is absolutely no doubt about it. And therefore, I am proposing here two things. First is, where is the problem? And therefore, I think the problem is with the way we think. And therefore, some very deep, sincere thinking and dialogue is required to bring this thing into our discourse. So thinking is one. The second is how do you communicate it? So communication is the second important thing, and how to build those communications in the classrooms, in the workplaces. That is the another challenge. And the third is what action do we take after the thought process has been established, communications have been made in the most articulate manner, convincing manner. So therefore, what is there to take action for? So this is one aspect. The second aspect is involvement of communities. That is very, very important because schools alone are not competent to handle because this is a social issue. This is an issue which has accumulated distortions of the past. And if we are going to dissolve that, I think the involvement of the community, in my opinion, is very, very important. And the third aspect is I have a proposal of what we call OMG. And this OMG is not oh my God here. O is for opportunity. I think we have to create conditions of access, conditions for participation of all possibilities that Jennifer was talking about, all variations of our being. So that opportunity as a community, as a school, as educator, we have to provide. And the second, of course, is material. So, the material, physical material, the resources, if you're not able to travel and because of non-travel, you're not able to attend a school, I think transportation becomes a material, the learning material, so providing resources, and that is what I call material. And that if opportunity brings you into the queue, the resources will give you opportunity to taste success. And once you have that, I think you need mentors, you need educators, you need peer group, and you need NGOs to guide you further as to how you move along. And that guidance will give you opportunity to grow and lead. So I think this structure of OMG, backed by thinking, communication, and action, is something that we can very easily foster within the school community and through our students to the community that we are serving. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pandey. So now we move on to this second round where our panelists will ask one question to another panelist. So there we go. Yeah, who'd like to go first?
I think it has almost become a tradition because I'm always the last speaker and therefore I'm very charged up. And therefore, I go ahead with my question. And therefore, my question is to Chandrika because I'm very fascinated by the fact that you are working with young children. And the thought processes and the habits and the shaping of the future, a large part is established and founded in the early childhood. So I would like to know from you that what all models are available through which we can foster this inclusion aspect in the young children. Unmute yourself, Chandrika. Yeah. Yes.
Sorry.
Yeah. No problem.
Sorry. I think that's a really good question in terms of models. I think considering that we live in so cohesive global as such, but still we do have different perspectives. We are influenced by lots of cultural contexts, which actually will enable or sometimes disable the way we actually present information to children. And I think considering young children to be very, they're very easy to be convinced, I have to say. And they're usually, I think they're not usually thinking about what happens if I don't do it, or what happens if I do this. And then they usually don't think about, do I please somebody? Do I have the somebody's permission if I do this or not? So they're quite open. They take things very easily. And then I think rather than having a big model that we want to impose on others, personally, I think from the perspective of the educator's role is to open up as an educator, try to see what are your own stereotypes. It certainly, you cannot say that, yes, I've had all my stereotypes undone. I do not have any stereotypes at all. So with regard to different situations, you might realize, oh dear me, that was a stereotype that I had in my head. So that's the time when you have to learn about your stereotypes, unlearn them, and maybe relearn something different. I think for me that from the perspective of an individual educator, it's very important to see what their own perspectives are, what their own attitudes are, and how can they influence, be a good role model to the children around them, and provide them with good resources, provide them, when I say good resources, diverse resources, that is not only reflecting their setting, probably it could actually relate to what is relevant. I think that's more important. And the relevance keeps evolving all the time. And then what I was saying earlier about Ainscough and colleagues' model of inclusion. So as an educator, it's the educator's responsibility to ensure that they encourage their presence, participation, and also the achievement of all those children around you. I don't know if I've answered your question. I mean, that was a very big question, but then I had to fit in.
Dr. Pandey, you're on mute. Dr. Chandrika, who would you like to ask your question to?
I'm actually very, very tempted to ask a question to everybody, but can I ask Cody, my question to Cody? It's quite fascinating listening to you, Cody, and I'm quite curious on your moving from America to Thailand, which is a totally different context, and I'm quite interested to learn of all the challenges that you've been through from the perspective of inclusion, and how your challenges that you're facing and challenges probably others are facing from your perspective. I don't know if that makes sense.
It's a great question. It's because it's very different contexts, right?
Yeah.
The historical background of why education is existing and then has expanded throughout the country in Thailand. There's the individual versus collectivist society, as you were talking about earlier, with families and community as a basis, and more of a network rather than an individual. So what I've concluded after 2 years of being here is that these same root things exist everywhere. Racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, on. But they manifest in different ways. And so I've personally had to go in, listen, talk, share if it's useful, experiment, have many conversations with colleagues up till 3, 5 in the morning about all these ideas, and hash it out. And I think, it's an ongoing process. And even after 2 years, I feel like I'm just starting to understand bits about the culture. But I think one big thing is across East and Southeast Asia, the use of school as a control and as a way to eliminate critical consciousness. So it's about uniforms, about standing in lines, about hairdos at a certain length, like the manipulation of your body to fit a certain space. I think that's been a larger function of schools and education in this region that I was really surprised to learn, versus the American, like, shout out the answer kind of a thing.
All right, thank you. Cody, who would you like to ask your question to?
I asked Hannah a question. So Hannah, you talked about individual and systemic, and I'm wondering, with the systemic reforms of maybe teacher training, curriculum, policy, textbooks, library books, how you work with those, what are some of your biggest challenges in trying to change those big systemic things? And how did you overcome those challenges, especially in the past 1 or 2 years with all of this news and backlash from communities about teaching LGBTed+ topics?
Yeah, great question. Well, firstly, I would say the battle is not over by a long way, and we keep working. I think one of the things that we really try to do and I try and do in my work is to meet people where they are. And as you'll have seen, some of you may have seen in the UK, there's been a real division in certain communities, particularly around faith and LGBTQ in education lately. And I think one of the things that we're trying to do is to have really kind of create those safe spaces where those conversations can take place to foster a deeper level of understanding between those communities, and actually understand that some of those communities are going through similar things in terms of the discrimination they face or the stereotypes that people place on them. One of the things that we're doing in this space, I suppose, the term that we're using is getting schools to be ready, not reactive. So making sure that schools don't come to us and say, oh my goodness, we have a trans young person in our school, what do we do? Rather, we're trying to get them to understand that gender non-conforming, gender queer people exist, and they will be out there in your school environments, and you need to be ready to welcome them. So in terms of curriculum and those sorts of things, it's really breaking it down for people to get them to understand that these structures that have existed, young people are challenging those. So actually, often the young people know more than the educators about kind of gender expansive, gender non-conforming, and those sorts of things. So often it's trying to have those conversations where the young people are kind of sometimes the educators themselves. And the other thing that we're trying to do is kind of, I suppose, at a policy level, just to try and be in those conversations too. And I think we know, and probably Jennifer will touch on this piece, is about if we don't have a diverse set of perspectives in the room, then we can't solve that problem optimally. So what we're trying to do is make sure that we've got a representative body of people in the rooms where those key decisions are being made. Because if the key decisions are being made in rooms that are hetero, cis-normative, et cetera, then they're not going to serve our communities well. And just to touch on a point earlier around communities, I think that schools aren't the only kind of agents of change in their communities, but for some communities, they really need leading through that change. Some communities won't know how to kind of approach these things. So lots of the work we are doing is seeing schools as leaders of those communities and trying to galvanize, for example, parent groups and educators together on these certain issues. So lots of things that we're doing, I suppose, at every level. Kind of, so there's some kind of really operational, practical things that we're doing, but at another level, it's about fostering that deeper understanding by making sure that there's a diverse set of people at those higher level kind of policy decision conversations.
Thank you so much, Hannah. Who would you like to direct your question to?
Well, I was going to ask Cody another question, but I think for fairness, I've got another question for Jennifer. So I'm interested. So thank you, Jennifer, for sharing the work that you do. And I think it sounds like you're doing amazing work. I'm interested in the notion of fragility, I suppose, and how you kind of encourage people to kind of drop their defenses and move forward to a place of understanding. Because I think that lots of kind of conflict that we see, or I see in the work that I do, is that the real fragility around what people don't know, and that makes them retreat into a place of kind of fear. So I'm just wondering kind of what your approach is to kind of work around that with people so that they kind of can move forward in this space.
Yeah, thank you, Hannah. And it's such a good question. If somebody could share the link to a very popular book in the US right now in the chat for everybody, it's called White Fragility. And it is, as reading lists circulate here in the US and everybody is beginning their anti-racism learning and journey, it's honestly one of those books that's sold out everywhere. And so Hannah's referring to a concept called fragility coined by that author. And it is, like you said, the reaction when we're told that we're not doing something well and we're not getting it right, or we use the wrong language. It is our defensive response, and it is our hurt, and our ultimately, for some people, either anger or emotion or retreat. And it's a difficult exercise. I know for me, when I get feedback, when I'm so well-meaning and my heart so much wants change, when I get feedback that I actually, my advocacy wasn't effective, even though I wanted it to be, it is difficult to hear that. And so, but that's a big barrier. What happens next with our feelings can derail us from what I call allyship. The work of being an ally is to get that feedback and to pop back, to get that feedback, to learn what we need to learn and not to descend into shame and anger and lots of feelings, but to process it, because there's so much we don't know and we're not going to get it perfect. And we need to bounce back and be back in the conversation. That's the important thing. So right now, what the US is going through, there's a lot of learning, and I'll just pick one group for white Americans to understand the Black experience in the US. And the fragility happens when we are told that we don't get something right. And it is our reaction, and our reaction really matters. It's not meant to say you're not going to feel a lot of feelings that are unpleasant or disturbing or shame or guilt for, you know, being directly or indirectly participating in a system in this country of unfairness. But what really matters is how an aspiring ally moves through that and moves to action. And so for educators, I think the thing to think about is when do you get feedback on how you're doing? Who do you get that feedback from? Is it difficult feedback to hear? Do you take it personally? And the point is not to take it personally. The point is to center the experiences of others and learn from them and listen, like Cody said, and don't make it about us. Fragility makes it about me. It makes it about all my feelings. It puts me, again, it makes me the most important part of the equation. And that is not true. We have to be very humble to the learning process. So educators, I would say, if you don't get feedback, you need to seek feedback. There's so much we don't know. There's no way we can represent all the lived experiences that we need to as educators. And we're one person, and our classroom is full of all kinds of identities. And so if we don't get something right, we want to seek that feedback so that we can be better. And so, Hannah, I hope that was a helpful explanation. I have found the concept to be, it named something that I think is a big derailer for progress. And we've got to get much better, more resilient in the face of our own fragility in order to move forward and be effective.
Thank you so much, everybody. Now we move on to the next section. So I have a very practical concern. So from countries where where Cody is also working. So or countries in the East and countries in the West, even in the US. You have a lot of cases where a child has gone to a counselor and the counselor has contacted the parent and told the stuff that the child tried telling the teacher or the counselor in confidence. So there have been issues where things are not the way that the child wants them to be, or even we want them to be. So one of the questions that I have is, how do you think educators can foster gender diversity and inclusion when the entire system around is very rigid, right? So as a teacher, I might be well-meaning. I want to bring about that change. I want to ensure that each of my child in the classroom is cared for, is valued, and is not bullied or harassed, right, for who he or she is. So what are the things that teachers can do in a situation where the entire system doesn't support the entire thing that we're talking about? Anyone can take this question.
I can start with the Thai context a little bit. Mind you, I'm still 2 years, so I'm still learning. But what I found is that the concept of bullying is not known. Like once you talk about this could be verbal, like people say things to you, they tease you and like you feel bad. They're like, oh yeah, I've been bullied. But they don't have that like everyday language. So some things about like, oh, defining that experience in a word in this context is new. Then the intense stigma around mental health and getting and asking for help is a big thing. Like even to go and see a psychologist, you would wait a year for like student services and things. But that's after like all of the shame of processing and trying to get the appointment and all of these things. So I think that's something that's really changing in the society right now with this generation, but mental health is a big thing that needs to be helped. And another thing, at least with Thailand, because it's really interesting, as the only non-formally colonialized country in the region, it's not under the same, it's under a different like gender sexuality system almost, because LGBT people are accepted and tolerated in some ways, but they're forced into certain stereotypes. So like trans people are comedians and funny and on the hosts of television shows, for example, or you have to be the good gay that gets a successful job and gets married and has like, or has a stable partner. So there are certain roles and stereotypes that need to be fulfilled, even in a tolerant society.
Can I come in, Aaryan?
Sure, Dr. Chandrika.
I think you were saying about how rigid the society can be and how difficult for an educator to actually make the difference. But then, as an optimist, I could say that you might be responsible for a small group of 6 children or 20 children, or I don't know. But still, you can make a difference to those 6 children, and then that will snowball, I'm sure. And then it's a matter of being open, and it's again how you are open to the children, how you are encouraging children to be open to you, which can be very, very difficult. But then once children start trusting you, they can be open to you. And then it's again bringing in those conversations from children, either through circle time seems to be quite popular these days. And then it's again, if you are reading a story, try to extend the story. What happens if? Why is this child so unhappy? Why is this child so upset? And then what can we do to make this possible? Or how can we help these children to, it could be I've heard something called persona dolls in England particularly, where the teacher or the educator might actually bring in sort of the context of a particular child. Maybe the child might be having maybe upset for whatever. It could be simple things like upset because of the pet is gone somewhere, hasn't come back before the child came to the setting. And then the educator can actually create the situation. Oh, how can we help this little girl or to cope with this issue? So it's again how, there is this little doll, almost a life-size doll. You actually make the child sit on the educator with the educator and then pass it to individual child in the circle time. And then children are very, very clever. They're very smart with their solutions. And then each child might have their own solutions for that. And although this child is still kept anonymous, the child might feel that, oh, wow, this is fantastic. I've got some ideas to think about perhaps. And then it's a way of including everybody. And you need not really think about what problems does this child have. It could be a general, normal, daily routine things, but then that might actually give the children the opportunity to trust the educator. And it actually comes from the right attitude, developing the right attitude and using the right resources. And I strongly feel that having 10 books about diversity, 10 books about children from different backgrounds, different families, some children having 2 moms or 2 dads, or it doesn't really matter having those things, but then accessing them and then having healthy discussions about them is more important. Thank you, Aaryan.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chandrika. Hannah?
Yeah. So I think a few things. I agree with everything that's already been said, but I think that also for me, it's about changing the notion of educators as imparters of knowledge, but also educators as absorbers of knowledge, because actually it's flowing all the time. So in order to impart the most current knowledge, and that knowledge is always, that stuff is always evolving around gender diversity, you need to be absorbing it yourself. you have a responsibility as an educator to be up to speed and up to date. And actually, as we know, for adults, some of our stereotypes are deeply ingrained. So it's up to us to do the work to kind of get rid of those things. I think one of the other things for me is that inclusion means everybody. So often we see in schools that the onus is put on the LGBTQ staff to lead this work, but actually that work needs to come from leadership. To Jennifer's point around intentional allyship, doing what you say and saying what you mean. Those sorts of things are really important in order to kind of change these structures. And I suppose the other thing I often say to people, which is a serious point, but some people might find it a bit funny, but when I went to school, I learned about the Vikings. I didn't become a Viking. When I went to school, I did not learn about LGBTQ, but I did become a lesbian. So I think it's trying to understand and tell people that like teaching this stuff is not going to change who a person is. It might raise their awareness, but it's not going to give them the tools to be that thing. It's going to give them the tools to see how the world looks and feels for different types of people. I think I would have made a great Viking though. So.
Of course.
I really like the way you put it. I think that was my next question to ask all of you. When you look at educators, there's a dilemma. If I'm trying to foster gender diversity and inclusion, would it affect the children adversely? So that was my question. I think, Hannah, you brilliantly put it up with a very beautiful example. Another thing that we see in the education sector that we also see is this majority of the schools that I have encountered with, whether it's in India, in the States or elsewhere, one thing that we see is still we have people who use non-gender neutral terms, like terms that do not foster gender diversity or gender inclusion. So Jennifer, my question is to you. So you have been a specialist working in the workspace. So now there's one role of teachers to foster gender diversity within the classroom, but I think there's a larger role that the workplace culture plays. So what do you suggest as practical tips that teachers can do and school leaders can do to foster gender diversity and inclusion without that coming across as something that's offensive to either faith-based stuff that you were talking about or to certain cultures? So thank you.
I get the hard question. Yeah, thank you. I struggle with this because I think that even students need to know the facts about disparities and inequity. But as somebody who's not a classroom educator, I'm also not a parent of human children. I have some furry ones, but I don't know, and I would love to know the panel's thoughts on this. With young people, like say high school age and even college, exposing them to how they may be treated differently and understanding the data and the research about that versus denying it and kind of sending a student out into the world thinking that they're not going to face different headwinds in their progress. I struggle with, and I really would love to hear, this is such an esteemed panel, and I know there's a psychological element to this. I don't want to discourage people, but I want them to be equipped, and I want them to know that they may not be heard in the same way. They may be in rooms where they are the only person. And what is the particular challenge and skill set and the support that we may need to provide as educators to that individual, because to sort of equip them with the knowledge of that they're not crazy, that they aren't, I don't like to use that word, but they aren't imagining the differences that will occur. And that I want to equip them with the understanding of how to rise through that, how to utilize their voice, how to become an advocate someday for themselves, for their identity, and also for more inclusive spaces that they become. And this goes for everyone in the classroom, not just people who are marginalized, as we say, but for majority people. We need to be the watchdogs as well, noticing who's not in the room, noticing what's being said about somebody because of their identity, noticing what we call in the US microaggressions, which is the sort of casual comments, jokes, language that people use when they're not aware of difference and they don't have an understanding. So I struggle because I think our job as educators is to prepare people for the real world. And if I had my ability to speak to young women, I would say, these are the things you need to know, and you need to be looking out for them. And for young men as well, have a responsibility to know about what happens in terms of gender. And cisgender people need to know what happens for trans and gender non-binary people so that we can be allies. But I'm not sure at what age people are ready to kind of absorb that information without it making it worse, if you will. And so there's this tension. There's this tension of not talking about things that I wish I would have learned as a student when I'm reflecting on, even as a white American. I was not taught about racism in school. I was not barely taught about slavery, barely taught about any of these things, never came up about being LGBTQ. And I feel that I missed out on a lot of my life of becoming a potential ally and somebody that's activated around this. And I was very late for me. And I'm in my late 40s now. So I'm kind of really disturbed about that right now. And I think a lot of America is really disturbed about it right now, what we didn't learn. So I that's very much on my heart and mind. And I don't know what the right answer is, but I know that we are not having the real conversation in classrooms for a lot of reasons, and that it impairs us as we enter the world of work from understanding, spotting the behavior, acknowledging it for what it is, being an ally, knowing what to do next in terms of changing the behavior, giving the feedback. And oh, by the way, also, I'm a young person in an organization. I don't have a voice. How do I speak up? How do I change the system? Do I have the right to change the system? Do I have the right to give this feedback about what's happening to me or what I'm hearing and whether I don't feel like I belong? All of that is about agency and about our sort of confidence and our psychological makeup. And I would like to think that can be built in the school process. So it's more of a question for the group. I would love to hear your thoughts on any of that.
Just to add to what you were talking about, I'm just giving you a bit of context. So in 1993, there was a research that was conducted by Hurt and Boxer. So what they spoke about was the mean age of self-identification as either you're lesbian or gay was 16.7 years for males and 16 years for females. However, the same people were aware of their attraction about the age of 9 for boys and 10 for girls. So this is the context. I mean, say, imagine the amount of years that are between 9 and say 16. So I think I just wanted to add to that and talk about the role that educators play at an age that is quite vulnerable for young people. So what are the things, again, that we need to be mindful of while we are working on this?
Something that, oh, do you want to go, Chandrika? Okay. So something I've learned in coming to the Thai context from the United States is reading Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire, which I've added to the chat box. And it's talking about the shift of how to end the cycle of oppression instead of just the colonizer and the colony, the colonizer and the colony. And ending that through the shift of, as I think Hannah was saying, the teacher as the authority figure, the person that knows all these things, to the, so it's, I think the biggest lesson I learned coming here is that seeing myself as a facilitator rather than an educator or teacher. So I facilitate the knowledge, and I just say, if I can support you in any way, if you have any questions or need support, please feel free to use me, to come to me and ask questions instead of telling. And I think that approach leads to all these other things like listening, supporting people, all of these things. So it actually links to decolonization as well, of white supremacy around the world. This shift to a growth mindset and being a facilitator rather than a teacher.
I love that. Cody, if I could build on that, in this conversation now in the US, we're talking about centering and decentering different voices. So I think what you're talking about, listening, leading with listening and facilitating the experience of others is what we don't know. And this is why we haven't had a full conversation about identity. And so the question is, I come back to kind of which voices are we highlighting? How are we stepping back if we don't have a lived experience and elevating others? How are we inquiring and curious and giving the floor to those identities? And I do this all the time in my world because I'm on panels a lot, and I say, do you really need my voice? I think actually you need this, this, and this voice. And so part of white supremacy is that dominance, right? That achievement. Yes, I'll do this. Yes, I'll speak about this. Actually, you don't know. There is so much you don't know. And so the art of stepping back and then having a lot of resources, I think it's incumbent on all of us. I think Hannah said this, we've got to be building a diverse network around us as educators so that we are exposed to all different kinds of identities, so that we have the right terminology and frameworks. And we have some familiarity with the experience of our students and the identity of our students that may just be emerging. I mean, they're not clear. They don't have the language. We need to have the language though, and we need to be ready. And I tell my managers this as well, in the workplace. You've got to be ready for when you have a trans team member. You should not be unprepared. You should be doing that work ahead of time so that you anticipate that this will be your reality. So for every educator, you've got gay kids, you've got trans kids, you've got gender non-binary kids. You've got to be ahead of it and always thinking. But the question to me is like, how are you doing your own learning? What are you exposing yourself to so that you can be ready and you don't miss a signal that you could pick up on and create a different outcome for someone?
Absolutely, Jennifer. Dr. Chandrika, you were talking about diversity being visible and invisible. If you could elaborate on that, that would be great. And also, what you wanted to say something else too, so please feel free. Thank you. Add to it.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think I strongly feel that visible and invisible diversity is what I relate to as like once you see somebody being different to you, it could be I am physically different to everybody else, maybe in the room that I'm teaching. But then of the 20 students that I'm teaching, there could be several students who may not necessarily relate to each other, who may not necessarily come from the similar backgrounds, or there might be certain things. But what I'm wary about is how we should not homogenize diversity and then put them all under one single umbrella and then see that the needs are same. Like if I have 10 children, 10 4-year-olds in my classroom, they all might look white, or they all could look black, or they could be brown, but then there might be some differences that is quite invisible to us. But then once you start giving them opportunities, once they start sharing their experiences, then you could actually see, oh wow, this child's family is made up of these family members. So the experiences that these children will get from these family members might be quite different. And then how can you engage the family? Again, it's again, how do we unpack the dynamics of that family, and how can we bring value to the experiences to all the other children? I don't know if I'm actually going away in a slightly different tangent, but then for me, diversity is visible and also invisible as well. So I think what we have to be thinking about is not only going by the visible diversity and putting them in specific boxes, but then we also need to think about those invisible diversities or differences that we need to consider about. Not necessarily we have to be really thinking of, oh, this child is something else. So we're not really probing that. We're not really being an inspector for that matter. But then it's going by how they play, how are they playing with other children, what comments are they making, are we reinforcing or not reinforcing their stereotypes? That's something that I think is very, very important.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chandrika. My next question is to Hannah. Hannah, I understand that in the UK you have relationship and sexual education, and you also have PSHE and things like that. But when you look at countries like, say, India, or you look at countries where there are no such frameworks, I mean, say the basic thing where you even talk about, so in a country like India, you don't have avenues where, like, children are taught about, say, sex education or things like that. Even the word sex education could connote something else, right? So what are the things that practically one can do, because you as a country, you have a system in place. So what is it that you would like school leaders here and educators to know, how can we do the entire thing without actually, like, rubbing the wrong way?
Yeah, wow, really, really good question. I guess it's so complex. I mean, I think to a point that we've kind of touched on before, is that my view is that anywhere in the world, schools are quite uniquely complex environments in terms of the stakeholders that we're working with. So generally, although they may not always act like it, in organizations you're dealing with adults, but in schools you're dealing with adults, you're dealing with young people, and then you're dealing with their parents. So there's this kind of, how do you grapple with that kind of quite unique ecosystem of views and opinions? And I think that actually, in terms of doing this work, if you don't have a framework around it, I would say that actually there's an opportunity, because we are also interconnected, to kind of lift up and see what others are doing within those frameworks, to learn from good practice. But also, I think it's the chance for educators, and I think we've all touched on this a little bit, is to think about, what did we want, what did we need when we were growing up at a basic level, in terms of how do we foster an understanding of the world? How do we foster an understanding of what a healthy relationship is, whether that is a relationship, a heterosexual relationship or not? How do we just start to have those basic conversations, and then draw into that those relationships can look and feel different? So I think for me, for people who are trying to do this work without a framework, understand that can be incredibly challenging. But I think it's about thinking about it at a human level, which is, what did I need to learn to be a kind of healthy citizen in the world, who kind of thrives and is happy? So I think that's one of the things. And just to touch on a point that we were talking about earlier, if I can just add to that, I don't know if anybody has heard of the work of Schools Out in the UK, or a woman called Sue Sanders. She's a brilliant woman. She founded LGBT History Month. So I don't know if she is watching, but a shout out to Sue Sanders. But she uses this word called usualize. So rather than normalize, she uses the word usualize. So embedding things into your curriculum, into your school cultures, into your practices that don't normalize, but they usualize LGBT existence, LGBT lives. And if you don't know her work, I'll put it in the chat. I'll put the her links to her website in the chat. But I think that is really important. So this stuff permeates through the culture of your organization, rather than a bolt-on in, say, SFHE or sex and relationships education. I think that's really critical as well, that it isn't just captured as this kind of add-on, and the LGBT community, but actually it's a thread through everything you do. So let's say you have a maths problem. That maths problem is described as, Hannah has two mums, they took her shopping, whatever. So trying to usualize it in that way is really important as well, just to make sure that it isn't this kind of standalone, this kind of standalone thing that is kind of shocking or interesting to people, so making sure it's a thread through everything that you do.
Thank you so much, Hannah. We are coming close to the end of this part of the discussion. So I have a question to Dr. Pandey. Dr. Pandey, when you talk about educational leadership, what is the role inclusion and diversity plays in the entire success of, say, a leader? So because we all talk about inclusive leadership, but how important is it in the context of a person's well-being and a person's identity?
I think it is absolutely important, because the first premise of educational leadership is that nobody should be left behind on whatsoever ever conditionality. So, as I said earlier, elimination of discrimination at all cost. So that is the first premise. The second premise is empathy for all, and that should flow directly from the top leadership. And the third thing is what I heard the conversations very engaging from all the panelists. But one thing is coming out clearly that today we have to recognize the agency of the students. Students of today are totally different from their counterparts 10 years, 20 years before. So they don't hesitate. They don't shy away from expressing and telling and communicating. As adults, we may shy away, but not they. So this is something that we have to leverage. This is something that we have to encourage. And then use their own agency to develop some of the problems solutions, right? I think somebody was mentioning in the chat box about the book and work of Carol Dweck, and I'm reminded of a very famous saying that she says, please be comfortable with the uncomfortable things. So, the purport of that is that if we have difficult situations, you asked the question earlier, somebody has been bullied, somebody has been body shamed, somebody has been name called, I think Jennifer or Hannah talked about microaggression, so all these, I think these are very natural developmental issues also, which come as the children grow. And the intervention of the adult here is something which is very, very important. So that intervention has to be full of compassion. It has to be solution oriented. It has to be a dialogue builder. And it has to be a fostering of new values and new thought processes. Because these are the children who are going to be adults. And if they are equipped and trained with the right kind of thinking, I think the educator's job is well done, in my opinion.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pandey. So now we open the floor to questions from the audience. So one question that I saw earlier on was, what are the practical things that a teacher can do to put this concept in reality? So I mean, say if anybody would like to go for that question. True, children are liberals, but family pressure affects them, is what one of the teachers says. So even what comments do you have on that? So I think we discussed about including community. However, there's a lot of pressure that if a teacher, if even a parent or somebody gets to know that the teacher is more, what do you call, inclusive, the conservative. So that, I think that's what the entire question is all about.
I think that is where the role of educators come in. The educators are actually becoming mediators between the parents and students also. You have to be an advocate. You have to be a diplomatic dialogue builder. You see, so you don't hurt the feelings of the parents, and yet you are able to communicate something. And at the same time, you also tell children that howsoever correct you may be, you have to position yourself, in the entire ecosystem. So the educators today have to be first-rate communicators. You have to be diplomats. You have to be advocates, and you have to be mediators. And I think that is what helps, at least in my experience.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pandey. So, what are the other questions we have? All right, so you can post your questions if you have any questions. In the meantime, because the questions are in the chat box and not in the question answer section, so it's a little difficult. Okay. All right, so question on resilience. So how can one foster resilience in the entire approach that we have? to say fostering diversity and gender inclusion. So what are the things that we can do to foster resilience in young people who are bullied? What can a teacher do to foster resilience and to ensure that, like, stereotyping doesn't happen?
I think is someone coming in, or I can take this question? So I'm just opening the floor, and then my panelists can join and help me, because the question is, somebody has been bullied. So you just imagine that I have been bullied by this question, and the panelists have to come first and foremost and tell me that we are with you. So show solidarity, kind of thing. So first thing is that the child is to be comforted, show solidarity, and tell him or her that the wrong has been done. I think that is the first balm which needs to be applied. And that will bring the process of resilience in the child. And let us say the R and E has already been injected in the child. And now the rest of the words and alphabets of resilience we have to bring in. And therefore, who is the perpetrator? What were the circumstances? How did it happen? What is the cost that that person has to pay? And sometimes, we end up this resilience taking a turn in which the victim comes and tells, so I have understood it, it was a mistake by him or her, he or she may be pardoned about it. And I think that is the success of building resilience, in the sense that you also learn kindness, you also learn how to forgive, and you also learn how to stand for your own rights. So your rights have been preserved, you have been supported, and maybe within the rules and all that, some punishments will also be meted out to the perpetrator. But if all of these things are absent, in my opinion, then the victim will be shattered. And then the process of resilience will get regressed by many notches, in my opinion. I think other panelists should help me build this particular response.
Sure.
If I can come in,
Yeah.
I think that point, that's a really excellent point, that notion of kind of restorative practice and getting people to understand kind of the consequences of what they have said or do. So lots of the things in the UK in schools at the moment, lots of schools track their LGBT phobia. So they track their LGBT phobic incidents, but not all schools consistently have those conversations with young people about what they mean and what the consequences of those things are. So making that more consistent and having those kind of restorative conversations is going to be really helpful. But also, I think one of the things when we're talking about this is not coming at it from a sort of deficit approach. So not just talking about how can schools tackle LGBT phobia, but how can schools shift the dial and actually start to celebrate those lives. So not talking about LGBT issues, but talking about LGBTQ, lives. So that's like a really important point as well, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
And feel free, anyone else to.
Yeah, absolutely, Hannah. The resilience is impeded when you suffer alone, you see. But if your suffering is shared and that suffering is mitigated by interventions of the people around you, I think that is the beginning of resilience, in my opinion.
Can I add to what Jennifer was saying earlier? Not Jennifer, Hannah was saying earlier. I strongly believe in the strengths model, wherein the individual child's strengths need to be based on rather than picking on the weaknesses. Sometimes it so happens that when a child is seen to be different, the bullying happens mainly because that is seen to be, unfortunately, a weakness, which is not all right, actually. So if the educator, from their perspective, try to build on the strengths or highlight the strengths of that individual child, that might actually bring in some confidence to the child, and others might see this child having good, strong, positive points, really. So that's my thoughts on that.
Another thing that I found interesting in the comment box is where Aisha Kiran, she's talking about we should try to make sure that every school should have a counseling committee to educate, understand, and resolve pupils' problems, which may also create upsets, not only children's lives, but school environment. So she's talking about schools constituting committees which can support young people. I think that's also a very interesting thing. And we have Ilham Hadidi, who has asked this question: what do you mean by he, him, his, she, her, hers next to your names, please? So I think what you intended, Jennifer.
I think, Jennifer, congratulations.
All right.
You have succeeded. Yeah.
It's the little things. Little thing. It doesn't need to be complicated. You know, I think this is a great example of a very small action we can take. I loved, Hannah, usualize versus normalize. To usualize the conversation that gender identity is fluid for all of us. It's not a binary. So that's why we use he, him, or she, her, or they, them. And we check in with people about how they identify. And, you know, for young kids, you know, they're getting younger and younger and able to articulate this in the US, at least. In some schools, even under, you know, K through 12, they will start a team meeting or group saying my pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm Jennifer, my pronouns are she, her, hers. Certainly in some American high schools, that's occurring. And it's an opportunity to not presume cisgender identity. So cisgender identity may be the majority identity in society. However, what we need to do for inclusion is make space for other identities. So the way that we do that is by not assuming in every interaction that everybody identifies the way we do. And so that's why we add our pronouns, so that we send a signal to anybody who may be listening on this call that your gender identity is valid. And we want to know how you want to be referred to. That's important to me. And so we're still in the early stages of this in the workplace. In the corporate world in the US, sometimes you'll see people put their pronouns in their email signature. So in certain companies, they have made an intentional effort to say this is not only okay, but it's something we encourage you to do because we're very committed to the LGBTQ community. And so this is what it means. This is why we would encourage you to do it. And people will add it into their signature. My pronouns, she, her, hers. So it's a signal, a very powerful signal, I think, for those of us who are hiding our true gender identity, which is a lot of us. Most people who are not, I don't want to say of the cisgender normal or the usual way we talk about gender, we are hiding. If we are deviant from that in any way, we are not talking about who we are, and we are certainly not bringing it up. We're putting a lot of energy towards hiding, a lot of energy that is really bad for our psychological mindset, our self-image, to feel that I have to hide a piece of who I am every single day and every moment of every day is devastating. So I want to change that.
All right. So I'm going to take one last question from here, from the audience. So the question is, would you please give some clarifications about normalizing versus usualizing, Hannah?
Sure. So as I said, this kind of term was coined by a woman called Sue Sanders, who, if you don't follow her, she's done incredible things for the LGBTQ community in the UK. And really what I mean by that is that this stuff is not an add-on. It's not a bolt on, yes, celebrate LGBT History Month or whatever, but that's not the only time that you do this. If it is the only time that you do this, and maybe you've got a statement on your website which is about we welcome all, people from all backgrounds, but you do nothing inside your schools and inside those cultures, then it's empty. So utilizing is about making sure it is part of your culture, that making sure that just the same as making sure that the heating is on in your schools in winter, you are talking about this stuff all of the time. So utilizing is about making sure that this is absolutely critically part of everything that you do all of the time, in your history lessons, in the conversations that you have at break time, in the leadership strategy that you have, in the things that you talk about, what you want to do, for children when they go off into their summer break. So thinking about utilizing means that this is not just that kind of exciting, shiny rainbow flag on the wall, and that's the only time you kind of talk about it. So it's about making sure it's a thread that permeates through all of the things in your organization. So those symbols of inclusion, the emotional environment, the physical environment, your leadership strategy, the conversations that you have, the language that you use, and the stories that you tell.
Absolutely. That's wonderful, Hannah. I think that was very illustrative. So just to end this segment and move on to the next one, I just wanted to acknowledge that Bhavna Ahuja, if I'm getting it right, she spoke about children love those people who have listening ears. So we have to create that society for them. So I think this panel discussion is also in that direction. And if you have received our emails, that you see there's a Japanese word called san that is being used, which is gender neutral. So the idea of not using Mr. or Miss, and we using that because we don't know whether you'd like to identify yourself as Mr. or Miss, or which part of the world you come from. So as a common culture, we have tried implementing that, in addition to what Jennifer spoke of, using pronouns in the signature. So I think all of us can do our bit. Now we move on to the last section, which is a really interesting question that I've been waiting to ask all the panelists. So the question is, what are the things that an educator should start, stop, and continue to foster gender diversity and inclusion within and beyond classrooms? So we all get a minute each.
Okay. So this is also almost traditional that I started so that others get a little time to think about it. So, Jennifer, you are very serious. It's not such a tough question. So I will start communicating, stop discriminating, and continue to have trust in the ability of the children.
Beautiful.
Dr. Pandey, what new thing can they start?
No, they will say what they can start. What I will start is bring new formats of dialogue among the children, which I'm working on. Yeah. So who is prepared to go next?
Can I join in alphabetical order?
Chandrika, yes.
I think I will start questioning, challenging own stereotypes, perspectives related to diversity, maybe more to do with the invisible diversity aspects. Perhaps I want to question myself on that, acknowledging and celebrating differences in people around me, especially children, their parents, their contexts, and using a wide range of resources as an educator, and of course, providing yourself as a good role model. And I would stop making assumptions. Homogenizing diversity is very important to me. Being tokenistic, reinforcing negative stereotypes. And I would continue sharing good practice, raise awareness, be positive, help others, celebrate diversity and differences. That's a long list. That's me.
Yeah, who would like to go next?
I think Cody is ready, it appears.
Cody is in reflective mode right now.
I am in such a reflective mode because I was going to start in the next couple of months. We'll launch the NGO, but I didn't want to do a shameless self-promotion. So I was like, should I say that? But I think start an organization. So it's not only us as individuals, but as collectives, starting and making this new transformation, this new normal takes organizations to do that. So that's something. Stop. I think I've noticed in reading A New Earth by Eckhart Tolle about making quick judgments about people and putting people in boxes. And notice where that's coming from. It's coming from my own insecurity. And I think that happens a lot in the classroom of like, this kid is disruptive, this kid is bad, this is that parent. When those quick judgments, how can you stop and analyze that? And then I think continue is democratic practices. I think democracy is really at a core of what we're talking about voice, about representation, about curriculum, about assessment. It all feeds into this democratic education and getting feedback, developing a growth mindset, and continuing to grow the society through many voices.
Okay, great.
Thank you so much, Cody. I couldn't agree more on this one. So, yeah. Who's going next? Hannah or Jennifer?
Jennifer.
Okay.
Because Jennifer was looking towards Hannah.
Yes, I'm ready.
Good observation, Dr. Pandey.
My notes.
Okay.
It's so hard to choose. Okay, I'm going to build on Chandrika's point about invisible diversity, which is the majority of our diversity dimensions. I think you could argue. So I would start creating the space for the non-visible to be visible and to be articulated, and to create space for conversation about identity. Create that space intentionally. Otherwise, it may not come up. Stop, I would say, trying to be perfect, or stop waiting to take action until you think you can do it well. You're not going to be good at it. A lot of this is new. And continue to, I'd say, build diversity of identity into your personal network so you can be a better educator. Evaluate who you surround yourself with, who you're reading, who you're listening to, and continue to educate yourself about identities that you do not hold, because I can promise you that those identities are all around you, but they're unarticulated and they're not seen and heard. And our job is to create a space where all of us can be seen and heard and celebrated and valued. And that's a really, really critical piece that some of us didn't have when we were younger, and we had to build it in other ways. So that was what I would say.
Yeah, good. Excellent. Yeah. Now, Hannah, you have no choice now.
That's fine. I've got some stuff. I think start is what I would say to do, and what I want to start doing more as well, is start listening more closely to the lived experiences that you don't know, that you don't understand. Start listening more closely to those. To Cody's first point, that kind of all ears approach, listen. Start doing that, because that's when you'll never truly understand it. But if you listen, continue. Stop is, I think try and stop yourself from having knee-jerk reactions to these things, understanding that this isn't trendy. Yeah. This is, don't follow the latest, hashtag if you're not going to do some meaningful and sustainable work in this space. And continue, I'm going to put it in the chat, but continue to have kind of level 3 conversations. So if anyone's heard of the model conversational intelligence, that's about how you move to those level 3 conversations, which is about co-creating together solutions. So sometimes the top-down approach works, but sometimes this is about having those conversations together. So continue having those really kind of collaborative conversations together. And I'll put the conversational intelligence work in the chat box.
Thank you so much, Hannah. Thank you, everybody. I mean, I think we are towards the end of this panel discussion. I want to remind all our audiences that my team will be sharing a feedback form right now, and also a certificate request form. So if you need a certificate, please fill in that form, and you'll get it within 4 days. As the entire discussion, I was just thinking about what kind of a moment we are in at this point in time. And this has been quite a reflection for us, for a lot of educators that I know, and this is also a moment for us to shape intentional and inclusive policies and nurturing practices towards creating an ecosystem that is truly empathetic, compassionate, mindful, and welcoming to all students. Educators and school leaders have a role, and also they have the power and potential to affect positive transformation. I thank all of you for sharing your amazing ideas. I understand that we still have a lot of questions that have not been that we have not been able to cover or answer them sufficiently through this panel discussion, and we look forward to hearing from you your thoughts, ideas, suggestions uh, on the role of educators in fostering gender diversity and inclusion. Please send me an email or tag us in your posts on social, and I'd be delighted to know more from you. Also, suggest what you'd like us to feature in the future panel discussions. On behalf of Global Citizenship Foundation and the Council for Global Citizenship Education, and all the attendees who from across our platforms, I extend my deepest gratitude to our panelists for taking out the time from their busy schedules and enriching this discourse through their amazing ideas, insights, and experiences. Also, I thank you for being a part of the OELF family and for everything you've been doing to advance this discourse on transforming education for human flourishing. The next panel discussion is on the 17th of July, and we will be discussing the question, can we empower students to be self-directed learners? See you soon. Until then, take care, stay safe, and spread love and compassion. The world needs it much more than ever. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Awesome,
Thank
awesome
you.
panelists. God bless you all. Thank you.
And awesome and our amazing
Thank
attendees. I mean, so
you.
they've been attending for a very long time, and I think some of them, it's such a delight to see them again. So thanks everybody, and have a great time.